Welcome to the Speculations reading series, now I think in its 21st season. I think we started in fall of '95. Co-production of Dreamhaven Books and SF Minnesota, a multicultural speculative fiction organization that also does a midsummer convention, DiverseCon. Fire sports are going around. The Speculations readings continue monthly, mostly on Wednesdays, and I don't have next month's lined up yet, but we'll soon. So if you sign our guest book and give your email, we'll let you know about the next reader. Tonight we're having for it's what, your fifth time maybe, something like that?
Ish.
I'm bad with numbers.
Something like fifth reading by S.N.Arly, fine short story writer, diverse short story writer, lots of different kinds of stuff. Some of it bright and shiny, and some of it very dark, and some mixing of it all. So anyway, we'll see what we have tonight. Take it away, Sherry.
Excellent. All right. We'll start with something really short and then read something a little bit longer. All right, so this is a piece of flash fiction. I don't normally write this short, but in the fall I did a writing challenge that had been suggested from some of my Tumblr friends that I would do some speed writing. And so they gave me prompts, and then I had half an hour to write a story from the prompts. And so I would use my lunch breaks to do these. So this doesn't actually have a title yet, and it's only 642 words, which is far under my usual short story length of around 7,000. So. The cool evening air was a relief after a full day stuck inside a warehouse with sketchy air conditioning. I pushed open the heavy glass door to the balcony and stood there for a moment just breathing. A bird-like shriek called my attention back into my apartment. I turned to see Spark pouncing around his dish, his usual pre-dinner performance. He paused and turned his yellow eyes in my direction before spreading his leathery wings and flapping to the countertop where he knew he didn't belong. "Hey," I chastised, "get down from there. This is not a self-serve buffet." He let out a protest, but settled all 4 feet onto the green counter as if to inform me that he'd feed himself if I didn't get on with it. Dragons may not be able to speak our language, but they sure as hell can communicate. All right, all right. I jogged over to prepare his dinner. "You've made your point, you crazy little reptile." He let out a trill, the noise he used when he was being cuddly and cute, and extended his head to rub against the back of my hand. I took a moment to stroke down his neck and tickle under his jaw. Spark was a baby yet, so he only weighed about 13 pounds. As a dwarf Yefashing, I could expect him to top out at 60. A little big for an apartment, but manageable. "Who's a clever little dragon?" I asked, running my fingers over the soft scales of his wing-shoulder joint. That got me another trill. He pressed his snout into my palm, his forked tongue darting out to brush my skin. Yeah, you're hungry." I scooped him off the counter and put him on the back of the couch where he could watch. That's when I made my mistake. I turned away to get his fish out of the refrigerator. I warmed it and cut it into nice little pieces. Okay, that should do it. I looked up just in time to see the trapezoid sail on his tail flick out onto the balcony. Oh shit, no, Spark, come back here! His flight skills were uneven, and the 3rd floor balcony wasn't safe for him unless he was in his harness. Still holding his bowl, I chased after. He crouched on the railing, leaning toward my neighbor's balcony and peering in her window. She'd moved in last weekend, and he was probably curious what all the noise had been. "Hey, silly guy," I called gently, afraid that he'd fall if I startled him. "Come here, I have your nice tasty fishies." He didn't even acknowledge me. If I didn't know he had excellent hearing, I would have assumed he hadn't heard. His wings arched up and he leapt to the other balcony. My breath caught until he landed, reasonably gracefully, actually. That's when he turned to look at me. He let out a little chirrup, then sauntered right into my neighbor's dark apartment. She'd left the door open this morning, and she clearly wasn't back from work yet. Shit, I muttered, rushing over to the railing. "Spark, come here," I called, using my playing voice. "You don't want to miss out on this nice perch, do you? It's your favorite." His chirrup was faint. He wasn't even standing near the door waiting for me. He'd gone exploring already, I could tell. That was trouble. Though Spark was a sweetie, he was still a dragon. And he was a terrible house guest. He tended to rip holes in couches and chew up carpets. He'd savaged enough shoes that I'd lost count. I had to get him out of there before he damaged anything and before my neighbor got home. We hadn't even properly met. It's very short. All right. All right, this is a tale worthy of song, and it's part of a series of stories that all take place in kind of a fairyland. And this was written after I was having trouble with one of my arms and it wasn't working properly, so I was wearing a splint a lot. And my husband wanted to help me more than I wanted to be helped. So, you knew that. Tale worthy of song. Princess Isilia was a knight in her own right, but she did not feel particularly brave, sitting in the palace's formal courtyard with her aunt. She worried the soft fabric of her skirt between her fingers. "You're going to muss yourself," Meritaten said patiently. She caught the errant hand and smoothed the fabric. Isilia offered her a nervous smile. "What if we haven't anything to say to each other?" "That's what you're worried about?" her aunt asked in disbelief. "You've conquered far more terrifying things than a prince." "That was easy," Isilia said with a bit of a laugh. "I wasn't going to marry any of them." She would have liked to meet Prince Randon in the labyrinth, where she was at most ease. Instead, their introduction would occur here, so their parents could observe from a distance, while allowing them some privacy. Meritaten patted her niece's hand before letting go. "You're so confident most of the time. I tend to forget you're still young." She smiled. "It's good that you remind me once in a while." Isilia looked around, making sure they were still alone. What if... She couldn't quite bring herself to say what worried her most. What if we have nothing in common, or he's rude or mean? What if we don't like each other? "All valid concerns," Meritaten said. "Marriage isn't always easy. You may both have to work at it. Handled well, you'll be happy." "That's not what the tales say," Isilia countered, purely for the sake of argument. Meritaten shrugged. "Not everyone finds their true love, sweetling. I'm not sure we all even have one." She shook her head. "You'd have to ask a philosopher, for I'm certain the fairies won't tell." The many kingdoms of La La Land were ruled by magic and forced by fairies. There was significant leeway within those laws, and fairy judgment was binding. "What if he finds me repulsive?" Her voice was a whisper. The words rushed. She reached over and rubbed her shoulder where her right arm should have been if her mother hadn't required a dangerous potion to save her life during her only pregnancy. Isilia was mad at herself for doubting her worth. She'd run away from home at 16 and spent 2 years abroad, acquiring skills her parents and tutors felt out of reach. She'd had adventures, and they weren't all fun. She'd spent a fair amount of time on the run and terrified for her life. She'd learned she could do far more than even she had dreamed. Hadn't she already proven herself? Yet here she sat, afraid her betrothed would reject her. "He won't find you repulsive." Meritaten's voice suggested the very idea was ridiculous. "He might," she countered. "He's grown up knowing about you," Meritaten said persuasively. "Even if he has the gall to be repulsed, he'll keep it to himself. His mother is your mother's dear friend. That's the only reason they agreed to the match," she muttered grumpily. She was startled by the unexpected slap of her aunt's hand at the back of her head. "Hey!" Meritaten gave her a stern look. "Have I knocked some sense into you yet, or do you need another one?" Isilia chose not to respond. "You're a lovely young woman." She crossed her arms while she looked at her niece. "You're intelligent and well-educated. You'll be no mere figurehead when you become queen. That's more than your parents expected, more than most people expected. The people of Thistlewidget have gotten to know you, and they adore you." Isilia shrugged. Her childhood had been tainted by encounters with people who assumed she was addled. It was accepted as fact that idiocy and deformity went hand in hand. Even those who loved her and wanted the best for her assumed the worst. She'd had to fight for everything that mattered to her, had to prove herself time and again to her parents, other nobles, and even herself. She felt a familiar lump in her throat and swallowed so she could speak without sounding like a toad. "I'm not as strong as I thought I was," she admitted. "How can this one meeting make me feel more vulnerable than ever?" "That's better," Meritaten said encouragingly. It's fine and well to be nervous about meeting your betrothed, but let's not get carried away. Isilia was relieved to hear that this absurd fear was normal. She caught a hint of sound and looked up. Her time as a roving knight had made her more vigilant, more aware of her surroundings. Given the occasional attempts on the lives of her mother and herself, she considered this one of the best benefits of her hard-won skills. "Here they come," she whispered. Her mother escorted another woman and a young man. The women walked arm in arm, smiling and chatting. Princess S.N.Arly was her mother's closest friend. As her husband had not yet inherited his throne in Everbow, she was more free to travel and came to Thistlewidget annually. When they were apart, the two women sent regular correspondence. She had 6 children, 4 of them boys. Prince Randon, a mere 4 months older than Isilia, was one of the younger sons. He'd never accompanied his mother on her travels, despite their engagement. Isilia might have liked getting to know him as they grew up, but then again, maybe not. She wasn't proud of her childhood actions as a whole, though now that he was here and their wedding was less than a month away, she wanted to get to know him as quickly as possible. As her aunt had said, relationships were work, and she wanted a hint that it would be worth it. After what seemed like hours, her mother and their guests finally turned down the path leading to Isilia's bench. She stood as they approached. Prince Randon was tall, but not handsome by contemporary standards. His cheeks and jaw were too soft to be considered chiseled, but Isilia found the effect less harsh. His eyes were light, nearly gray, and seemed too closely spaced across his narrow, long nose. His fair brown hair was pulled back into a short tail dictated by modern fashion, and he was dressed as she expected a prince to be. His burgundy hose and doublet were good quality without being gaudy. His lips were turned up in a smile that made him more approachable than many other nobles. "Isilia, you remember Princess S.N.Arly, of course," her mother said, stepping away from her longtime friend to touch her daughter's shoulder. "It's so good to see you," Isilia said, slipping her arm around the other princess. "I hope your journey was pleasant." S.N.Arly hugged Isilia firmly, then stepped away with a smile. "There was a bit of rain, but nothing could dampen my spirits." She patted her son's back, encouraging him to step forward. "And of course, this is my son Randon. I hope you are as eager to meet him as he has been to meet you." He reached for Isilia's hand, briefly catching her eyes with his before their fingers touched. "It is a pleasure to meet you at last." He brought her knuckles to his lips. His smile widened enough to show a hint of white teeth. "I've heard tales, of course," he said with a small shake of his head, "but I'm always cautious about accepting the words of others as fact." Isilia hadn't heard much about Randon save what her mother and S.N.Arly had told her. He was a better archer than swordsman. He'd done well in his studies, favoring history and philosophy over mathematics. But he was not a crowned prince, a hero, or a villain, so there were no songs or stories to precede him. Isilia gestured to the bench behind her. "Would you like to visit a while?" "I can't think of anything else I'd rather do," he replied, standing until she sat down. Isilia waited while their chaperones made their way to other parts of the garden. She wanted to be more frank than social rules allowed, and she didn't want to be overheard. She didn't fear scandal, but it was unnecessary to upset their mothers. The silence was a little uncomfortable, and she tried to reassure Prince Randon with a smile. "Are there specific questions you have for me, Princess?" he asked. "I'm yours to command." "I'd like to dispense with the formality, if you don't mind." She was careful to keep her tone light, a recommendation rather than a criticism. He only looked a little surprised, and she wondered if he'd expected it based on what he'd heard, or if he was simply good at keeping his responses under control. "As you wish." "We don't have much time to get to know each other, and while courtly manners are useful when we're on display, they will delay that end," she explained, hoping she didn't appear rude. That wouldn't set the tone she was aiming for. She ran her hand over her skirt, pressing out the wrinkles. "How do you feel about marrying me?" He smiled, a pleased expression. "I've been looking forward to it." "Does it bother you that I only have one arm?" she asked. She often found frankness more to her advantage. There could be no misunderstanding, real or feigned, and people tended to respond more honestly if they didn't have time to prepare for the discomforting topics. He shook his head, but paused before responding. "I've always known I was going to marry you. My parents didn't delay announcing it to me or anyone else. I've also always known about your physical condition." He held out both hands, palm up. I think my mother hoped that if I knew all along, I wouldn't be surprised or dismayed later. He met her eyes again. I assure you, I am neither surprised nor dismayed. She was relieved Narelle had thought ahead. Good. I wouldn't want to marry someone who could only think of me in terms of my deformity. Even if the tales are only half true, I suspect I would have difficulty thinking of you that way. He took her hand loosely, but she had no desire to pull away. I see that you are as beautiful as rumored, and that overshadows your difference. Isilia looked down for a moment. She wasn't accustomed to being told she was beautiful, especially after her impediment became clear. She liked the gentle touch of his fingers, politely seeking familiarity without assuming it. She realized that these same fingers would touch her elsewhere before too long, and her face flushed. Although she'd never taken a lover, she wasn't ignorant of such things. For a moment, she was too distracted to think of anything to say. Carefully turning her thoughts back to the present, she struggled to restart their conversation. I haven't actually heard the tales myself. That surprised him. Really? They're quite commonplace in Everbow. Well, my aunt tells me they're popular in Thistlewidget as well, but no one recites them around me. She shrugged, careful not to disturb their hands. It seems too self-important to ask the bards to play them for evening entertainment. I hadn't thought about that, but you're right. Prince Randon smiled again. I'll gladly tell you all about your adventures if you'd like. He held up a cautionary index finger. But I won't sing. I can't carry a tune in a bucket. Isilia giggled. We are well matched then. I don't sing either. He let out an exaggerated sigh. You've no idea what a relief that is, Princess. Isilia, she corrected. She met his eyes for a long moment. We're to be married, so I think we should be familiar with each other. If we don't develop the habit now, it will be difficult to change our ways. Thank you, he said, giving her fingers a little squeeze. I couldn't agree more. His smile changed slightly, making his bearing more shy. I have a confession. I have waited to hear my name on your lips with no small anticipation. His ears and cheeks turned pink. Why is that? She wondered if his thoughts had also turned to the more physical implications of their fledgling relationship. I think it will make this all feel more real. He gestured vaguely to the courtyard. As I said, I've grown up knowing I was going to marry you, but I didn't know you, and it all seems more like a tale about somebody else than a plan for my life. I have a little trouble believing my good fortune. He could turn a pretty compliment, and so far she liked him. The touch of his fingers made her warm and tingly. It was a good start. You're sweet to describe it so, but I think you're being a bit excessive, Randon. He beamed at her, his delight making him all the more attractive. Perhaps, he said softly, or perhaps not. He raised her fingers to his lips again. Why so simple an action should make her feel such happiness, she didn't know, but she didn't care. Why don't you tell me about yourself, she said. I'd like to know you better. Shall we take turns, he suggested. It's hardly fair if you learn all about me and I still know very little about the real Isilia. He looked at her more closely. I'm sure the maiden from the tales is very nice, but I suspect she is not precisely you. Agreed, but you first, she prompted. I need time to think of something worth telling. Randon led 2 horses from the stable just as Isilia stepped into the courtyard. She recognized her own mount, a gelding who masqueraded convincingly as a docile lady's horse, though he was trained and competent in battle. She wondered if she was late or if Randon had gotten there early. He often did, claiming he wanted to make the most of their outings. She suspected he was trying to be helpful. He looked up and saw her when she was about 5 meters away. Good morning, Isilia. His smile made it clear he was happy to see her. I hope you slept well. She felt herself smiling in response. It was nice. I did. You look well rested. He grinned. I admit I had a little trouble sleeping. I was excited about seeing the city. It was late afternoon when you arrived, she said, puzzled. Didn't you see it then? He shrugged. We drove through it, but my mind was on other things. He winked at her as he looped the horse's reins over his left arm and reached out to adjust her cloak. She caught his hand, holding it against the light wool. Why did you do that? She was careful to keep her voice merely curious. He looked startled. You were a little lopsided, he said quietly. I could have fixed it myself. You do know that, right? She was afraid if she didn't address the issue now, it would be harder each day. He could suffocate her with his kindness. Randon nodded. I didn't mean to offend you. He slipped his fingers out from under hers and stepped back. I'm sorry, I only meant to help. His eyes were downcast, his countenance dejected. That was rude of me, she said, wishing she could start the morning over. She wanted to take his hand again to impress her sincerity, but worried that would make things worse. By social rules, she outranked him, but she preferred to think of them as equal. They would be soon enough. I don't mind being helped, but sometimes I like to do things for myself. He nodded again. I didn't mean to imply that I assume... He stopped and took a breath, collecting his thoughts. You're more independent than I expected. He shook his head, almost looking bewildered. I'm not sure why that is, because I knew you'd done so much. She suddenly wondered if his parents and tutors had over-prepared him, expecting an invalid as a wife. The attraction she'd felt for him on their first meeting had grown in the last 2 weeks. He was kind and thoughtful. He wasn't intentionally diminishing her, but then again, few people did so on purpose. She took half a step closer and dared to touch his jaw with 2 fingers. Please look at me, Randon. She made her voice gentle. He slowly raised his head, and she withdrew her hand. I'm not upset with you, and I hope I haven't hurt your feelings. She offered him a tentative smile. We've come to know each other a bit, but we still have much to learn. Certain it was the right thing to do, she closed the distance and lightly kissed him on the cheek. She barely heard his swift intake of breath over the voice behind her. Mind your manners, princess, Aunt Meritaten said brightly. Her eyes were full of mischief when Isilia turned to look at her. It seems just as well that I've been selected to chaperone the 2 of you on your ride to the city. Good morning, Your Highness, Randon said, bowing elegantly to Meritaten. Be a dear, Prince Randon, Meritaten replied. Could you go fetch my mount as well? It's the gray mare in the stall nearest the center. She took the reins for the other horses. I'll watch these 2 and make sure the princess doesn't depart without you. Randon smiled. He was growing accustomed to Meritaten's ways. Thank you, my lady. I shall return swiftly. Once he was out of sight, Meritaten glanced at Isilia. May I ask what I interrupted? Isilia let out a disgusted sigh and shook her head. It was an apology. Meritaten looked skeptical. I wouldn't have guessed that. Well, sometimes he's just a little too helpful, Isilia explained. Uh-oh. Did you lose your temper with him? Isilia rolled her eyes. No. She could have a fiery temper, but Randon hadn't evoked anything so severe. We're still new at this. We're still figuring each other out. It's just going to take a little more work and time. Be gentle on him, Meritaten suggested. He seems genuinely fond of you. Isilia smiled. I know. And you must keep in mind that he may worry about his adequacy. She shook her head. No, I didn't mean it that way, she winked. He's marrying a hero, an adventurer. He may feel useless and insignificant next to you. That hadn't even occurred to her. But he's not, she said quickly. Meritaten smiled. Just make sure he knows that. Isilia handed her bouquet to Randon's younger sister, then turned to face him. She couldn't quite stop smiling, and was pleased to see that he seemed similarly afflicted. He took her hand in both of his while they recited their vows. The words had been memorized and practiced, and while she meant every one, she barely heard them just now. Their brief courtship had been relatively smooth, though there were still the rough moments. He was making an effort to mend his overly solicitous ways, and she appreciated it. In recent days, it had become clear that the desire was mutual, and she had nearly forgotten her fear that he would find her repulsive. I now declare you wife and husband. The fairy's pronouncement cut through Isilia's thoughts. As she and Randon turned to face their guests and witnesses, Isilia realized something was wrong. The applause and cheers masked other sounds that had no business at a wedding. Mounted soldiers, masked and dressed in black, charged in among the wedding party from the nearby woods. Others appeared on foot from behind trees and from underneath the formal garden's large gazebo. If she had realized sooner, things might have gone differently. The crowd surged, and she and Randon were separated. The royal guard snapped into action, and she was surrounded by a wall of blue. She tried to push her way back. Randon! There was no way he could hear her over the bedlam. She realized then that he was the target. The invaders were avoiding her. My husband! Where to Prince Randon? She shouted at the guards. She cursed her fluffy blue dress, and the fact that there was no way she could be of any use as she was. caught flat-footed and weaponless. Though the guards had rushed toward Randon, they moved too late. She saw him collapse. "Randon!" She renewed her efforts to get past her protectors. He was heaved aboard one of their horses, unconscious or dead. They avoided danger and seemed keen to protect him, so it was likely this was a kidnapping, not an assassination attempt. She had to hope he hadn't been hit too hard or in the wrong place. Isilia tucked herself into the embrasure of one of the windows in her mother's war room. At the table, Queen Valeska's advisors and Thistlewidget's loyal nobles debated. It was hard to pick out a thread of conversation in the chaos. She looked down at the letter in her hand again. "Dearest Isilia, I have been instructed to write to tell you that I am still alive. Since this is our first correspondence, you may wish to have my mother verify my handwriting. There are no windows in my cell, so I can give you no clues as to where I am. I suspect this is intentional, and I am certain this letter will have been read by many others before you see it. I assure you I'm terribly embarrassed to have been taken prisoner. It seems a most inauspicious start to a marriage, and I apologize. Perhaps we should have taken that stroll through the labyrinth after all. All my love, Randon." She carefully folded the parchment along its original creases. Narelle had confirmed the handwriting as her son's, but Isilia had already known. No one else was aware that she had suggested a walk in the labyrinth the night before the wedding. Alone, in a place where they wouldn't be disturbed, she was quite certain what would have come of it. Since they were to be married, she saw no harm in circumventing their chaperones. Randon had been tempted, but reluctantly confessed that he wanted to do things properly. Although it hadn't been confirmed, it seemed very likely that Randon had been kidnapped by the same branch of the family that had poisoned Queen Valeska when she was pregnant with Isilia. If they kept him alive, Isilia couldn't legally remarry. She couldn't bear legitimate issue, and the throne would fall to the next available line. Isilia often wondered why more hadn't been done after her mother was poisoned. She'd heard the arguments reflecting a shadow of doubt on the evidence, but was unimpressed. She was biased, of course, a fact her mother pointed out whenever the subject arose. "How are you holding up, dear?" Aunt Maritotten's arm slipped around Isilia's shoulders. "I'm all right." She wasn't happy, but she wasn't about to get hysterical. "What are you thinking?" Maritotten looked suspicious, as she had every right to be. She had aided the princess in her quest for independence at 16. Isilia didn't respond right away. "I think we're wasting our time. Do you have a plan?" Her voice was little more than a whisper. There was no point in lying, and she knew her aunt wouldn't stop her. "Yes." "Do you need to discuss it?" Isilia shook her head. "It's pretty straightforward." Maritotten nodded. "That's the best kind. It's far more likely to succeed." She squeezed her niece's shoulders. "Is there anything I can do?" "If you could see that Rascal is saddled and ready to go by moonrise, I'd appreciate it." She stood then, raising her voice so it could be overheard. "I'm going to go lie down for a while. I don't feel well." Isilia could sense the rising sun, though it had yet to penetrate the forest. Even with multiple stops for Rascal to rest, and one longer nap for herself, she'd made good time, but she had yet to get a solid lead on Randon's location. Dismounting, she led Rascal into the trees. Well off the Queen's Highway, she found a tall and majestic cottonwood, its trunk wide and deeply grooved. She dropped the reins to approach it. Rascal wouldn't go anywhere without her leave, and he wouldn't let anyone take him. She walked clockwise round the cottonwood twice, then turned and circled it once widdershins. She raised her head and let out the call of a magpie. She forced herself to remain calm and outwardly patient. Fortunately, the wait was short. "Welcome back, my lady," a man said as he stepped out from behind one of the other trees. He was dressed in green and brown, all the better to hide in the forest, and even knowing what to look for, she hadn't seen him until he spoke. His hair and beard were a mix of gray and brown. Both were braided. He didn't appear to be armed, but Isilia knew better. She bowed to him. "Thank you, Brer. I would say I'm glad to be back, but I don't want to lie." His smile smoothed away some of the wrinkles on his face. "I've always appreciated your honesty, lady." He glanced round and walked closer. "I assume there's something I can assist you with?" "And I assume you know what it is." She closed the distance between them and reached out to grasp his forearm in greeting. The old master of the wood was one of her finest teachers. To most of Thistlewidget, he was merely a character in a tale. While some made him a brigand, she knew better. He and his people merely wished for the freedom of life in the forest. They were hunters and archers, not farmers or craftsmen. Her mother assigned them to guard the wooded roadways. Discharging this one duty, they were allowed to live as they liked. They saw far more than other people, and were rarely seen in return. Isilia had already made more use of their skills than her mother had. Bad business, he said, shaking his head. Your mother should have cut that canker out when she first had the chance. He and Isilia were often in agreement on management practices. His experience with his people, spread throughout the forest, made his insights invaluable. He let out a series of short whistles. Isilia knew the pattern and wondered who he was summoning. There were too many of us to deal with when they passed through, he said, apologetic. It wasn't your responsibility to stop them, she assured him. He gave her an odd look. They took your husband. How can you not hold us accountable? Despite their past association, he looked surprised. Isilia shrugged. We shouldn't have needed you to keep him safe. I should have been able to do that at the palace without help. We followed, watched where they went, he explained. I'd hoped you might. She'd counted on it. Did Random look all right? She knew he was alive. Did she really want to know more before she rescued him? It was his turn to shrug. He looked humiliated. She winced. What he'd been through was enough to break some people. She didn't know him well enough to have any idea how he'd handle it. She'd just have to give him whatever time he needed to heal. He'll be fine, Brer assured her. Do you know where they have him now? All her tentative plans hinged upon that information. Were you aware that your cousin Penthor had a manor house tucked into the forest near the village of Ardra? Brer asked. Does he? She suspected very few people knew about it. My scout's last report said Penthor had sent away his hired mercenaries. He said slowly, now that the excitement has died down, some of my people were thinking of taking a visit to Ardra to stock up on some necessary supplies. Thank you. She would have gone alone, and it meant much to have his aid. Brer smiled. You've promised to continue our arrangement when you become queen. It's in our interest to ensure that no one comes between you and your throne. She slapped him lightly on the back. Surely that's it. It has nothing to do with me personally. He winked. Of course not. The daughter of one of Brer's scouts was a maid in Penthor's manor. She'd grown up in the forest, and her first loyalty was to the people there. She had taken a servant's post in the village to see what life there had to offer. Most of the forest's children did something similar in their youth. Many returned to the forest, others remained useful contacts. Although the young maid had not seen Randon herself, she was familiar with the entire house. A single room functioning as a wine and root cellar made up a large part of the basement. There were also a couple of rooms used for storage. At the far end, there were 2 dungeon-like cells, the sort of thing respectable people didn't have in their homes. On Penthor's current visit, she'd been instructed to stay out of the basement. Leaving Brer and his people on the main floor, Isilia quietly made her way into the basement. Her caution allowed her a few seconds to assess the room before she was noticed. Randon was locked in one of the cells. Fortunately, he was conscious. At first, he didn't seem to recognize her. Then her cousin Penthor leapt to his feet from the table where he and 2 of his sons sat playing cards. All 3 shouted alarms and scrambled for weapons. Although they had been keeping largely out of sight during their stay, they clearly weren't expecting a raid. The next several moments were blurred for Isilia. She raced across the room, desperate to reach Randon before any of his captors. Her charge didn't bring her within striking distance of Penthor, though she was able to kick one of his son's knees sideways, effectively removing him from the fight. She was nearly to Randon's cell when 2 men burst out of one of the storage rooms. Isilia fought them off, parrying and thrusting quickly. She needed to be done with them before the others came on her from behind, or she would die, and so would Randon. Fighting left-handed threw most opponents. Since she couldn't carry a shield, she'd had to learn to be fast, and to fight dirty if needed. Her slim blade darted forward, slashing the neck of one of the men. His sword clattered to the floor as he clutched at the wound. His partner went to his aid rather than continuing his fight with Isilia, so she abandoned him. She slipped her foot under the hilt of the dropped sword, quickly bringing it up to her hand as she dashed the rest of the way to Randon's cell. "Are you chained?" she asked, as she looked behind for pursuit. "I know you'd prefer a bow, but this will have to do." She turned her hand to offer the awkwardly held second sword. He took the spare sword through the bars. "The man you cut down, he has the keys." Before she could get back to the man with the keys, Penther came for her. He was one of those handsome nobles who always dressed perfectly. Things fell into place for him in ways they didn't for others. Isilia suspected his luck was more the result of money and power than skill or true good fortune. She had never forgotten that he was the one who had poisoned her mother, even if no one could truly prove it. It was because of him she had only one arm, and her mother had nearly died giving birth. He looked intent and confident. She knew he thought the tales of her adventures had been constructed to make the people of Thistlewidget love her despite her deformity. After their first few exchanges, his confidence faded. He growled and called her names, taunting her to provoke her to rush and make a mistake. But she was beyond hearing anything he had to say. He couldn't make her more angry than she already was. She managed to move the fight closer to the two men on the ground. Sliding back, Penther fell over them. While he was rolling backward, she turned to the man with the keys. The tip of her sword went through the ring on his belt, slicing through the leather in the process. The keys came free. With a jerk of her blade, she tossed them to Randon before leaping over the men after her cousin. Penther's uninjured son had come to his aid, and she again faced two opponents. She launched a rapid attack. She rotated their fight so she no longer had her back to a man with a sword. In a series of quick moves, she disarmed Penther's son, his blade falling well out of reach. His look of shock suggested such a thing hadn't happened to him in some time. He was unarmed, and for the moment less of a threat than his father. She turned back to Penther. He was no longer handsome. He was roughly the same age as her parents, and those years were suddenly visible. A commotion in the back of the room distracted him. She struck. When she slashed his right arm, his sword fell from his hand. She followed with another slice to his chest. She couldn't let him live, and would ultimately have to deal with his family. Though she hated him, she had to show some compassion, or she'd risk losing too much support. So she was quick and sure when she cut his throat. While the other injured man might yet live, Penther would be dead in moments. She surveyed the room as Randon reached her side, his borrowed sword in hand. No one else seemed inclined to fight her, though that would change if she lingered too long. "Let's get out of here." She jogged toward the steps, making sure they were clear before leading Randon up from the basement. Brer waited near the kitchen garden door she had used for her inconspicuous entrance. She paused and looked at him. "Get your people out, then burn this place down. It's not our concern who doesn't make it out." Brer nodded, then whistled shrilly. He followed Isilia and Randon away from the house. From the nearby trees came a gentle rain of flaming arrows. Randon paused for a moment to watch. When he turned back to her, Isilia had crouched down, laying a piece of cloth over her knee. "We'll be out of here soon," she assured him, as she wiped her blade on the cloth. She slipped the sword back into its sheath before looking at him. He was dirty and looked tired. "How do you feel? Are you all right?" she asked, touching his cheek. Sorry, the scampering child was distracting. "How do you feel? Are you all right?" she asked, touching his cheek. "You're beautiful," he whispered, sounding awed. She peered into his eyes, suddenly worried that he'd been drugged. She was sweaty and grimy and covered with other people's blood. There was nothing beautiful about her. "I mean it," he said, catching her fingers. His expression made it obvious he knew what she was thinking. "You move so fast, so smoothly. You're like fire." He glanced at the house, its roof in flames. Beautiful and dangerous. She wasn't sure how to respond to that, so she chose to counter it. "I have to move fast, faster than any opponent. To do so, I need to be efficient. That makes me look graceful." She pulled on his hand. "Come on. We won't be able to get home tonight, but we can get cleaned up and get some rest." Randon nodded, obediently following her into the woods. Brer stayed behind with a small group to keep an eye on things. The others accompanied Isilia and Randon to their unnamed village. It was nearly a full day's walk. She'd left Rascal and her spare gear behind the afternoon before. Those who had stayed were ready to receive them with warm supper. While food was dished out, Cecilia excused herself to clean up. She was bone-weary and knew she was likely to fall asleep while she was eating, and she didn't want to wake up in the same bloody clothes. She doubted anyone would dare change her while she slept. Even those who had seen her early clumsy training efforts with Brer couldn't forget who she was. She smiled when Brer's oldest son took charge of Randon, dragging him off for a wash. She was well into her bowl of stew when he returned, dressed in green and brown, his hair damp and tousled. The colors suited him. She smiled warmly as he sat down beside her. In all the planning and chaos, a part of her had forgotten that they were wife and husband. "Hello," he said, looking a little shy. She balanced her bowl on her lap so she could take his hand. "Do you feel better?" He nodded. Before he could respond further, he was presented with his own bowl. "No one makes stew like our people of the forest," she said quietly. "I've eaten enough of it to know." She waited until he started eating to continue. "I'm going to warn you now. I'm pretty useless for the rest of tonight. Odds are I'll be unconscious before you even finish eating." She gave him a reassuring smile and rubbed his back. "I don't want you to think I'm ignoring you because that's not my intent. I want to hear anything you have to say, anything you think we need to talk about, but it will have to wait till tomorrow." He nodded again. "Thank you." Randon secured Rascal while Cecilia laid out the tent. More than a year of traveling had taught her exactly where to stake things in order to put it up without assistance. While she would not have refused the offer, she was glad Randon found something else equally useful to do. She tossed her bags into the tent's opening before pulling a small tin from her pocket. Inside sat the dozen white rocks that made up a fairy ward. As a human, she had no magic of her own. One of La La Land's many fairies had given Cecilia a gift of protection when she set out on her own. She carefully placed each stone in its position around their campsite. Only a fairy would be able to see them now. People passing by would feel inclined to keep on their way. When she finished the ward, she saw Randon's boots outside the tent, tucked under the rain flap. She smiled, relieved. He had some idea what camping involved. Not many nobles did. She poked her head into the tent and was pleasantly surprised to see that he'd laid out the bedroll and blankets to make a single large bed. He was barefoot, sitting on the bedding. His lone leather vest was draped over one of the bags, and the ties of his simple green shirt had come undone enough to show his collarbones. He'd apparently brushed his head against the ceiling of the tent because his usual tidy ponytail was in disarray. Hair hung into his face while he rummaged through the bag of food Brer had sent. He looked up, pushing the hair back with one hand. She couldn't bring herself to look away from his pale eyes as she crawled across the blanket and bedroll. She stopped only when their knees touched. She hadn't thought much beyond saving him from her cousin. Now that he was safe and they were alone for the first time, she remembered full well how his presence affected her. The thought that he might not be ready for any form of intimacy after his ordeal didn't dampen the excitement that raced through her. Before she could ask how he felt, she found herself in his arms, one hand on the nape of her neck and the other on her back as he leaned down to kiss her. The first was gentle, a tender homecoming. It was followed by a longer, more inquisitive kiss. Cecilia slipped her fingers into his hair as the third flared into something hungry and daring. They had exchanged several kisses and stolen unchaperoned moments before the wedding. Then the thrill had been colored by a feeling of rebellion and a fear of discovery. Now it simply felt right. She slid her hand down his cheek and neck to further loosen the ties on his shirt. Cecilia pressed her cheek to his. "In case you couldn't tell," she whispered in his ear, "I'm very glad to have you back, Randon." His arms tightened slightly as she said his name. I could tell. Still holding her, he leaned back just enough to look into her face. "And in case you hadn't guessed, I'm just as glad." His smile held more than a little wonder. He slid his hand around from the back of her head to caress her cheek. "I feel I've been cheated out of too much time with you." She smiled, thinking along similar lines. "Perhaps we can make up for it." "I was hoping you'd say that." He kissed her again as he eased them down onto the blankets. Cecilia looked at her hand resting on the bare skin of Randon's chest. She could feel the steady beat of his heart under her fingertips, and that somehow made him more precious to her. She smiled, thinking she was silly but not caring. "Are you awake?" he asked quietly. "Yes." She had no desire to get up, though, and eventually she would need the supper they had delayed. He raised himself on one elbow, catching her eyes with his. "Last night you were too tired to talk," he said, "and on our ride today you seemed most interested in exercising my demons." "I want to be sure you're all right." She brushed the side of his foot with her own, caressing him without having to lift her hand. "I wasn't sure what they'd done to you, and I need you to know that I'll do what I can to help you put the past behind you." As it turned out, he was mostly embarrassed to have gotten kidnapped. It had been humiliating to be used as a tool against her, but he didn't seem to hold unreasonable guilt or fear. He smiled, letting out a small laugh. "I feel well supported by you." He playfully touched the tip of her nose. She stared into his eyes a moment longer. "I want our relationship to work, Randon. I don't want it to be simply a convenient way to deal with our individual situations. Maybe we won't have the kind of love that bards sing of, but I think we can be happy." To that end, she needed to be honest with him, even if it sounded unromantic. He laughed again. "You need not worry on that score, Celia." He kissed her cheek. "I was half in love with you before we married. Then I saw the other side of you, the side the bards celebrate." She glanced away, feeling heat in her cheeks. "When you first came into that cellar, I was terrified that I was going to have to watch you die." Though his fingers played lightly on her cheek, his voice betrayed his fear. She looked back at him and caught his hand so she could kiss it. He shook his head. "Watching you fight was amazing, and you were doing it for me. I admit, seeing how graceful you are made me want you." It was his turn to blush. It didn't matter that we were both far too tired, not to mention badly in need of a bath, and surrounded by people who would have gladly killed us both. His arms tightened around her. "I wanted you then and there." Hearing him say so felt so good she had to smile. "You're a fair, strange man, Randon." He laughed out loud. "And I've married a fair, strange woman," he replied. Then his face turned serious again. "I could almost thank your cousin. I understand you now. I know what you're truly capable of and how ignorant I was when I met you." She wanted to contradict him and opened her mouth to say something, but the words didn't come, and she closed her mouth again. "It's all right. I know it's true." He smiled. "I won't say it was stupid. That's unfair to me, but I was misinformed." "It happens all the time," she assured him. He shook his head. "It shouldn't, and I'm not going to let it happen again." He looked completely content. "I understand now what you can do and how I can help you, without being a nuisance." A strange sense of peace settled over Celia. She basked in it for a long time without speaking. "You're right," she said at last. "We are going to make this work, and who knows? The bards may sing about us after all." How late do we go?
Let's have a reception at 7:30.
Excellent. I have 2 super short stories left. Oh, I read this one already. All right. These both came from that same writing challenge where I was given prompts. This one. Yes, let's have this one. This one, the prompt was, "I'm an elf with really bad aim." Stupid forest. Stupid rite of passage requirements. Stupid bow and arrow. So I'm not your typical elf. Yes, I'm tall and can pretend to be a willow tree if I really try. And it's dark. And you're half blind. I can stomp through the woods without making the kind of noise that draws attention, even if I want to call attention to myself. I'm pretty smart, though I don't think I'm really old enough to be considered wise. I mean, who's wise at 19? My people have a rich culture mired in our history, and no one clings to tradition and history like elves. I mean, I have some cousins on my dad's side who still work for St. Nicholas, despite the fact that their great-great-great-great-grandparents fulfilled the terms of that indenture contract. This might sound excellent if you prefer stability to uncertainty and custom to progress. Now, I'm a philosopher by nature, though my brother would say I'm argumentative, but that's just not true. I feel it's healthy to question everything. I mean, just because something worked well 500 years ago doesn't mean it's still the right choice today. But nobody listens to me. So here I am, tromping through the forest, trying to kill a poor, defenseless animal to prove myself a contributing member of society. I proposed the much harder and more interesting coming-of-age challenge of creating and maintaining a garden for an entire summer, but the elders completely shot that down. I don't even eat meat. This whole thing is barbaric. Ugh. Through the trees, I see movement. Great. It's a deer. Rolling my eyes in disgust, I knock an arrow and pull back, aiming down the shaft. I feel sick. I let the string slide off the tips of my fingers, and the deer bounds away into the low shrubs. Holy fuck! My eyes widen as I hear the loudest and most interesting string of profanities echo through the trees. Have I mentioned that I'm an impressively awful archer? Oh, Elfwaru, I whisper, wincing. I've hit someone and she's really unhappy about it. Instead of running away, which is what most of my kin would do, I dart toward the shouts. Are you okay? I call, then I shake my head as I realize she won't hear me anyway. Stupid magic. Oh, my alder, I am so sorry. I push my way through the sumac to find my victim. She's bent over to the side, clutching at her upper arm. Her eyes are pinched tight and her breathing is shallow. I see my fletching protruding from the back of her shoulder. I drop my things and rush to her side. It's going to be okay, I whisper. Here, sit down. I have no idea what to do about this, but I have to make it right. Her head snaps up in surprise, and the front of my jerkin is clutched in her fist before I have a chance to step back. Who the bloody blazes are you? She demands, giving me a rough shake. I'm Hudney, I answer automatically, which is weird because I'm never that forthcoming with strangers. I reach out and try to peel her hand off my clothes. She's older than me, but not by as much as I would have expected. But then again, she could just look young. If her face wasn't contorted in rage and pain, she'd be very pretty. Who am I kidding? She's pretty even with her twisted expression. Her skin is the red-brown color of oak leaves in fall, and her eyes are almost black. Then I catch sight of a necklace peeking out from under her tunic. She's a wizard. I am in so much trouble. Let me help you, please. How do you propose to do that? She demanded, giving me another shake. I can no longer meet her eyes. In any way that you wish. I'm so sorry. Please don't turn me into a beast. I wasn't trying to shoot you. I didn't even know you were here. Elfwaru, my mouth runs over. Please let me make this right, I beg. She releases me and I flinch, expecting the worst. You shot me? Her voice is quiet now, somehow reminiscent of a deadly snake. I reluctantly nod. I'm supposed to be proving myself a capable adult, but it's barbaric and I'm terrible at archery. I swear I was aiming for a deer and I really didn't want to hit her either, but I missed anyway and I guess I hit you because that's definitely my arrow and I'm really, really sorry. I only stop when forced to take a breath. Please, sit down. You're in pain and it's my fault. Let me help. I am normally not successful at funny, so there was giggling. That made me happy. I have one more super short one. This one came from the prompt, do you have a map I could borrow? And it's not super original, but it was fun. Excuse me, the young voice startled me, and I looked up from where I was hunched into the trunk of my car, rummaging for the jack. She looked Japanese and about 14. Her black and silver clothes made me think of the night sky. She stood in the center of the sidewalk, a hopeful expression on her face. Do you have a map I could borrow? She asked. It took me a moment to pull my brain from the track it was on to one that could answer her question. Poor kid was lost. I realized she wasn't alone, though. Another girl, similarly dressed, stood in the grass several feet back. She was holding what looked like a couple of brooms behind her back. I don't have a paper map or anything, I said, wondering what had happened to the one I used to keep in my glove box. But I could pull one up on my phone if that would help. She looked puzzled. You can do that? I smiled and straightened up, taking a step closer. Yeah. I pulled my phone out of the back pocket and held it up for her to see. Here, I'll show you. My fingers slid quickly over the screen, unlocking the device, then navigating to the map app. While it loaded, I turned it toward her. That's a phone? She blinked a couple of times. I nodded. Don't tell me you've never seen a smartphone. That didn't seem possible. She smiled, and something about it was secretive. I've never seen a phone like this. She glanced over her shoulder, her straight black hair swirling out about her. Son, do you want to see it? The other girl shook her head stiffly. The first one shrugged and turned back to my phone. She's a little nervous, she whispered. It's her first big outing, and she's never been lost before. You have? I asked. The map loaded. I tapped the GPS button, and it adjusted to our location. She giggled. Oh, lots of times. So why don't you have a map? It seemed a bit obvious. Oh, it's much more fun if you have to work at it, she said. So it's more memorable. You don't ever forget and get lost in the same place twice. Where are you from? I asked, thinking it odd a girl her age was accustomed to getting lost. Her philosophy about it was strangely matured. Oh, you wouldn't have heard of it, she assured me. It's just a tiny little town. She stared at the screen. So we're here? She pointed to the red pin marking our place on the map. Yup. Where are you trying to get to? She chewed her lower lip as she thought for a moment. I think you call it Raspberry Island. I smiled. It sounded like she was a tourist translating the place name from her own language. Do you have a different name for it? I turned my phone sideways and dragged the map a little to find the island. Of course. Oh! She smiled brightly and pointed to the screen, careful not to touch it. There it is. She glanced back at her friend. We're only a little off course, son. We'll be there in no time. So, what are you doing? I asked. How'd you get lost? Oh, we're meeting at Raspberry Island, she said. We've all been left someplace we've never been, and we have to find our way there. She looked up at me. Don't worry, it's not cheating to get help like this. So it's a competition or something? Someone had dropped young teens all over St. Paul with these instructions? That seemed kind of harsh. Oh, it's more of a test, she corrected. Do you need a ride or want the bus schedule or something? Raspberry Island was easily 3 miles away. She grinned. Oh, no, thank you, but it's very kind of you to offer. She looked at my car, parked at the curb, and I do appreciate you interrupting what you're doing to help us. No problem. I'd forgotten about my flat tire, and the break from that frustration had actually been quite welcome. Have a good evening, she said before turning to her friend, her hand held out. The other girl passed one of the brooms to her. Thanks, you too. Then I froze and watched dumbfounded as they straddled their brooms and floated up into the evening sky. When I finally got back to my tire, it was no longer flat.